Chapter 11 of Judge Burnham's Daughters. Judge Burnham's Daughters by Pansy. Chapter 11. WCTU. No, Mrs. Burnham had not known this. Her husband's business interests were so extensive, and the pressure of care upon him so heavy, that even had he deemed it worth mentioning, he might not have thought of it at an opportune moment. And, indeed, he was so decidedly a man who threw off business cares the moment he reached his own door, and who never even thought of such a thing as chatting confidentially with his wife about them, that to have remarked, "The Shenandoah property came into my hands to-day, through the failure of the firm of Bell and Peeler," would have had an absurdly inappropriate sound to him. So Ruth sat silent and appalled before the news. Her husband the owner of the Shenandoah! This, then, was why she might naturally be supposed to have power in the question at issue, and her cheek paled over the realization of how powerless she was. Her instant change of manner was not lost on Mrs. Bacon, who shrewdly said to herself, "She didn't know it before, and it evidently makes a difference into whose pockets the results are to go. Oh, me! Who would have supposed that a Christian woman, with a son to rear, would stop over considerations like these?" And she was as correct in her conclusions as the majority of persons are who sit in judgment on the acts of their brothers and sisters. Mrs. Burnham spoke at last, slowly, choosing her words with care. She had no mind to show the sorrowful secrets of her home to Mrs. Bacon. "You give me credit for altogether too much power, dear madam. Gentlemen are noted, I believe, for supposing that their wives know nothing about business, and, in my husband's case, it would be fair enough. I profess to know very little in that line. Besides, Judge Burnham is preeminently a man who does not discuss business out of business hours. In proof of which I might tell you that I did not know he was the owner of the Shenandoah. The utmost that I can do is to repeat my assurance of sympathy and willingness to help in whatever way I can, at the same time reminding you that I may not be able to accomplish anything." Yet, as she went wearily up the stairs, after her caller had departed, she thought that nothing could be more unpropitious for her schemes in regard to the evening party than these questions of conscience which seemed to be pressing in on every hand. Nevertheless, as she thought more about Mrs. Bacon's petition, her courage rose. Judge Burnham might not be a total abstinence man, but he despised drunkenness, and, being a lawyer, well versed in the ways of the world, he must know how disastrous to the interests of a place which boasted of itself as a safe country home for young people would be the introduction of that which did more than anything else to make life unsafe. Besides, and on this she built strong hopes, Judge Burnham's pride would be at stake. Would he want it to go out through these earnest women that he feared for his rents to such a degree that he was willing to introduce wines and brandies as security? It would certainly have an offensive sound if she put it to him in that light. She thought so constantly about it and went over her arguments so many times, that she worked herself into a state of feverish haste to have the interview over. She dreaded it, but went steadily toward it with much the same feeling that one has in laying vigorous hold of any cross which must be borne. If this thing must needs be, let me get through with it as speedily as possible. Judge Burnham was in his worst mood, courtly, suave, and sarcastic. Yes, he had met some of those interesting females who went about attending to other people's business. One always wondered who attended, meantime, to their homes. Women's constant talking unions they ought to be named, the tendency to talk steadily, for an unprecedented length of time, on subjects of which they knew nothing, seeming to be a marked feature of their organization so far as he had observed it. He had always thought that if he had been so unfortunate as to choose a wife with no more brains than to join herself to such a company, he might be justified for once in returning to the old blue laws, and confining her on bread and water until she came to a better mind. Which particular member of the troop had honored her with a call? Oh, yes, he had the honor of a speaking acquaintance with Mrs. Stuart Bacon. He had supposed her to be remarkable for nothing but a very ill-shaped mouth, but it seems she had other accomplishments. No wonder the mouth was ill-shaped, since it had such ungraceful work to do. Yes, he had the honor of being the owner of the Shenandoah. It had not entered his mind to object to the lessee's proposition. Of course the law sustained him. It would be a return to the dark ages with interest, if a man must be dictated to as to what he should have for his money at a hotel. There was nothing unpleasant about it, nothing that reasonable people could object to, merely light wines, such as orange wine and the like, wholesome and refreshing beverages for refined people. The class of guests that patronized the Shenandoah would not be likely to demean themselves in any way. They took care to keep the prices too high for the common people. Oh, yes, the same law admitted light wines to the other, more common hotels of the place, of course; but he didn't own them, and had nothing whatever to do with their affairs. As for his influence, he imagined that he should succeed in conducting himself in the future as in the past, in such a way as to be above reproach, at least outside of his own family. Of course Mrs. Stuart Bacon and a few gossiping women of her clique would talk. That was their special forte, as he had intimated. Probably he would come in for a share of the censure that they distributed so liberally, but he believed he was able to endure even that. In short, Ruth knew long before the interview was concluded that her plea was utterly hopeless. The very pride on which she had depended seemed to be a weapon turned against her. His pride would not permit him to seem to be swerved from his position 1/2 inch by what he was pleased to term gossiping interference in what did not concern them. I have not given you an idea of the half he said. Through the entire interview he maintained his ironical tone and careless manner, omitting no opportunity for using the keen sarcasm in which nature and education had made him an expert; maintaining, also, his air of exceeding politeness and courteous attention, even bending to draw a wrap closer about his wife when he saw that she shivered, and himself rearranging the open grate fire which he knew was one of her luxuries, and finally paring with much care an orange, half of which he presented to her on a fruit plate in the midst of one of her earnest arguments, with the smiling statement that perhaps she would not object to orange juice in that shape, although she had spurned his other offering meant for her refreshment. Altogether, Ruth went from the room more utterly humiliated than she ever remembered to have been before. That she had signally failed was only too evident. That she had nothing but failure to report to the waiting and hopeful ladies was mortification enough, but there were deeper reaches to it than this. How had it happened that she, who had been so eagerly sought after, so earnestly and persistently wooed, chosen without a doubt because she was beloved, how had it come to pass that after the lapse of years she really had no more influence with her husband than this? Failing in appreciating her conscientious scruples, why did he not, at least in a matter of this kind, involving only money, take pleasure in yielding to her whims if he pleased to call them so? She knew husbands who gratified their wives from no higher motives than such as these. Why was not her wish in these matters a law to him, which it gave him pleasure to follow? Long into the night Ruth questioned and wept and prayed and mourned. Nothing was plainer to her than that even the Christian life for which she thought she was all the while contending had been largely a failure. She had succeeded only in irritating her husband by her display of it. She had brought no sunshine into her home or life. She had not yielded in places where she could have done so, as well as not. She had consulted her tastes instead of her husband's, even where conscience had had nothing to say. She had been a painstaking mother, but even here she had failed. Had she not often let her morbid fears of what might happen, not to the soul but to the beautiful body of the boy, push in and thwart some cherished scheme of his father's? Was it, after all, any wonder that when she suddenly confronted him with her opinions, and almost demanded from him actions in accordance with her ideas, that he should resort to sarcasm and irony and hold his ground? Never had poor Ruth's insulted conscience read her a sterner lecture than on that weary night. Humiliating failure, and the humiliating confession to her own heart that she was in a sense to blame. And the very hardest of it was, that she saw no way out. She could not explain these things to her husband, because he was on such a different moral plane from herself that he would utterly misunderstand her. He would think she had confessed herself as wrong in principle, and would immediately, as indeed he had already done, plan for the most impossible concessions to his views. But in the meantime she must put aside all these burdens and decide just what to do. She had promised to report the result of her effort. How should she do it? She could write to the ladies, would explain that her husband had given his word before she knew anything about the matter, and could not withdraw from it honorably. He had said as much. Could she not repeat it? And was more detail than this necessary? Yet her honest soul revolted from such a statement, for she knew at this moment that the matter was still not so fully settled but that had it been made to appear for Judge Burnham's interests to change, he would probably have done so. The furthest she got at last was to determine to wait another day until her intense excitement and pain had had time to dull a little before she attempted any report. Afterward she wondered whether even that had not been a concession to the enemy which had caused her more trouble. In point of fact, 2 days passed, and still she had made the waiting and anxious ladies no reply. As she went down to dinner on the evening of the second day, she assured herself that she would write that letter the next morning before 10 o'clock, but she did not. Life had gone with her during these 2 days much as usual. She had seen almost nothing of her husband, he having been detained in town late by reason of some professional perplexity. The young ladies were busy with their regular routine of society life. The week had perhaps been unusually gay, and Ruth and her boy had spent much time alone. Was it fate, she wondered, or Providence, that led her that evening as they were on their way down to dinner, to say with sudden fervor of appeal to the impressionable boy the words she did? They had been standing by the window watching for papa, and had seen, reeling by, a young man, scarcely that, a mere boy in years, well dressed, with the air even then of the well-bred about him, but with that painful swaying in his walk that can mean but one thing. And the boy had been startled, dismayed, and had questioned eagerly, and returned to the subject again and again, and the mother, with a terrible pain in her heart, had recognized the young man as Mrs. Stuart Bacon's son. On the way downstairs Erskine had put his other question, and then she had turned to him with this appeal: "My boy, promise your mother that you will never touch a drop of anything that can possibly make you walk as that young man did." "Why, mamma, I have promised, you know. I promised you, and I promised God." "I know it, my darling. Promise again. Mamma loves to hear the words. Whatever happens, whoever asks you, unless you are very, very sick, and the doctor, and mamma too, if I am there, say it is right." She could not help that little proviso. And the boy promised again. Then they went into the dining room, and that miserable orange wine was on the table. It had been on several times since the first scene connected with it, and the Judge and his daughters had drank it when they would, but none had been offered to Mrs. Burnham or the child. Judge Burnham was not in an amiable mood. Heavy wrinkles made seams across his forehead, and his eyes had an irritable glitter in them. Truth to tell, he was not so indifferent to the tongues of a few gossiping women as he would have his wife imagine, and the Women's Christian Temperance Union, while waiting for their report from Mrs. Burnham, had by no means been idle, and sentences not complimentary to his name had reached his ears several times during the day. These, in connection with certain other business perplexities, served to make him less ready than usual to throw aside care. I am afraid it must be admitted that it was pure maliciousness on the part of Minta that made her suddenly exclaim, looking at Erskine, "How thin and pale that child is growing! He needs tonics, I believe. Here, Erskine, take a swallow of this, and see how nice it is. It will be good for you." And she held toward him her glass of wine. It was maliciousness, I suppose, but not very deep. She was rather fond of a little scene, such as would call a flush to her stepmother's face, and give them the benefit of a sharp passage at arms. She expected nothing more. but almost in the same breath with Erskine's, "Oh, no, thank you, I don't want any," came his father's stern command. "Erskine, do as your sister tells you, at once." Then Erskine, trembling under the weight of the sternness, he had never been spoken to in that tone in his life before, "Oh, but papa, I can't. Please excuse me. I cannot drink any wine." "Obey me immediately." "Oh, but papa, I can't, you know. I promised." "Erskine, either obey me immediately, and take a drink from that glass, or go to my dressing room, and wait there until I come." Trembling, frightened, half blind by the rush of tears, the little boy did not hesitate even for a second, but went across the room and out of the door. It was well that the meal was nearly concluded, and the servants had left the room. The mother felt that though her life had depended on it, she could neither have eaten another mouthful nor spoken another word. As for Minta, to do her justice, she was half scared and wholly repentant. A messenger came just as they left the table with a business telegram for Judge Burnham. He detained the boy while he wrote a reply, and Ruth went with swift steps to his dressing room. "Mamma, oh, dear mamma," said the frightened child, "what made papa speak so to me? Was I naughty?" "My darling, did you not keep the promise that you made to God? How could that be naughty?" "But it made papa angry. Oh, dear mamma, what will he do? Will he whip me, do you think, like the boy in the picture?" "My darling, that was a picture of a drunken man. You have no such father as that. Papa does not understand. He will let you explain, I think. I will see him myself if I can." And to the baby's urging that she would stay with him, she turned resolutely away, assuring him that that would be treating papa rudely, and that she would try to see him, and explain what Erskine meant. But she did not. He went directly to his dressing room by way of the library staircase, and let himself in at the back door with his key. Chapter 12.